Welcome to the Aspen Institute's Education Innovation Forum and Expo. Please welcome to the stage Walter Isaacson, the President and CEO of the Aspen Institute.
Thank you all very much for being here. I'll keep talking to the microphone. Mike, I'm waiting for it to be brought up. This is me vamping. Whoa. As we do our mic checks in front of you all, I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank Gary Huggins and Jim Shelton and Ann and everybody who put this together. And it's my great pleasure right now to bring on stage the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and Dr. Alan Greenspan. And Gene's on his way, right? Gene Sperling got called in to do the State of the Union pre-brief with the President, and he's supposedly on his way. So come on in. We'll start with Secretary Duncan, and Alan, come on, have a seat.
Where have you got me?
I've got you next to me.
Secretary Duncan.
Yep. Secretary Duncan, thank you for putting this together with us. And tell us why you feel there's a sense of urgency now to get things like this done.
I just want to thank you, first of all, and Aspen for being such an extraordinary partner. Thank everybody for coming this morning. Just a couple basic facts that most folks in this room know that I think compels us to act differently, compels us to challenge the status quo, compels us to think about innovation as critically important for our country. First, most of you know we have about a 25% dropout rate in this country. That's about 1 million young people leaving our schools for the streets each year. That's economically unsustainable, morally unacceptable. There are no good jobs out there today in a globally competitive economy for a high school dropout. Secondly, if you look at college graduation rates, a generation ago we led the world in college graduation rates. It's really interesting. We've flatlined. It's not that we've dropped. We've flatlined. We've absolutely stagnated. 9 other countries have passed us by. They're out educating us, they're out investing, they're out innovating, and they're going to outcompete us and continue to outcompete us. And then finally, if you look at the recent international benchmarks, the PISA results of 15-year-olds reading math science, we rank anywhere from like 14th internationally to like 31st. And so looking at any of those, high school graduation rates, dropout rates, college graduation rates, international comparisons, we're nowhere near where we need to be as a country. And so the brain power here, the innovation, the creativity to get not just incremental change, but fundamental and dramatically better outcomes for young people is what this is about. And I think the collective brain power in rooms like this make me, for all those challenges, make me very, very hopeful about where we can go as a country.
You know, if Benjamin Franklin went into a classroom today, he'd totally recognize it. It'd be the same thing that he did, 300 years ago.
He'd be right at home.
Why is there not much innovation?
That's a great question. The education sector has been very, very slow. I mean, starting with our calendar being based upon the agrarian economy. Ben Franklin's day, folks are working in the fields in the summer. That's not true today. You see how technology has transformed how we do business. Technology has transformed how we engage socially in our social networking. Technology has not transformed how we do education. So education has clearly been much more resistant to change than other sectors. And I think these kinds of really innovative public-private partnerships can help us break that maybe not even decades, maybe those centuries-old logjam.
Do you think it's partly because we don't have a competition in the marketplace for most of what we do in education?
Absolutely. I think that's a piece of it. I'm a huge fan of choice and competition, lots of different things. The other thing that I think has been so interesting in education is that we haven't had a common yardstick.
Right.
So if you work in the business world, your stock price is published every single day. Folks know how you're doing. If your sports team, basketball, football, baseball, that scores in the paper, it's transparent. As a country, we've been very, very loose in this. 50 different standards, 50 different goalposts, every state with their own measuring stick. Most of those standards have been dummied down due to political pressure. And I think that lack of transparency has led to an acceptance of a status quo that is fundamentally harmful to children, harmful to states, and ultimately harmful to the country. We're seeing, as you know, a huge breakthrough now, common standards, 40 states working together, college and career-ready standards for everyone. But I think that lack of a common measuring stick and transparency has led to a passivity and a complacency that's been damaging.
How do you think the common standards will help promote innovation or allow people to innovate?
This is an absolute game changer. And I think when the history of public education is written, this is going to be a big, big piece of that story. When you have a common goalpost, a common measuring stick, there are huge efficiencies, there are huge economies of scale. States are spending billions of dollars doing their own individual thing goes away. It changes the power structure between states and textbooks or technology companies. And what it does is, with a common measuring stick, we can now watch across the country who's accelerating student achievement. And those places, those innovations, whether it's better teachers or better principals or better technology or more creative uses of time, we'll be able to look across the country and see who's really moving the needle and then take that to scale very rapidly. That has not happened yet in this country.
Dr. Greenspan, where do you see the history of this? What happened a generation ago? I think Secretary Duncan said that's when we started flatlining.
I wish I knew. I mean, if you look at the data, you can go all the way back into the 19th century as the kids came off the farms, first went into grammar school, or the so-called legendary schoolrooms. And then we had an explosive boom in high schools, pretty much at the turn of the 20th century, which was a seminal event in education in this country. And it created an extraordinary expansion in educational capabilities, which led into World War II. And what people forget is that a very large number of young American men had extraordinary schooling in the technologies of how the manufacturing system worked in the United States. I mean, the old joke was that there wasn't a single GI who wouldn't know how to diagnose a problem when the Jeep went down and where to put the spark plugs and how to rewire the system. And that capability, coupled with the GI Bill and the fact that we had very high graduation rates out of high school, meant that we got a major increase in the quality of the workforce, which was precisely what we needed as the technologies that were evolved in the military began to be applied in the private sector, with the result that we had a fairly extraordinary expansion in the quality of our workforce, in the education of our workforce, and it was such that it kept up with the increasing complexity of what happens to cutting-edge economies such as ours when output per hour continuously rises. And that continued virtually without any significant slowing until, I guess, when would it hit? Probably 1975 or thereabouts.
So 1975 is when you had a slowing or a decline in education leading to productivity.
Yeah, I think that at the time, everyone thought it was ephemeral.
Ephemeral?
Yes, because we had been just through 150 years of just progressive growth. And, I mean, when I was a child, the notion that the United States had by far the best education system was never questioned. I mean, you had the elite systems in Europe, and Europe, unlike the United States, which was an egalitarian society, tested their young children to determine where they went. And there are many countries now which do that. If you just don't come out right on that test at the age of 10 or 11, your life is over. And you are destined to essentially jobs which are low intellectual, low output per hour type of jobs. We don't do that. We have, as the Secretary says, a competitive system, and indeed, if you look back across history, the competition within the various different areas of our education system from K through to college was really a very important driving force. We have largely lost that or something. In any event, go back to your original question. I know how we got to 1975 or thereabouts. I don't know why we stopped.
Wait, okay, 75, you're in the White House. I think you have Gene Sperling's job, right?
No, I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Ford. And were there technological changes in the society, social changes?
No, because if you go back, the only way you can measure the issue of technological change in the context of what it means, the output of the economy and the system, is to look essentially at output per hour. Productivity is an abstraction. Output per hour is a statistical calculation which we make all the time. If you go back, as we have, to, say, the latter part of the 19th century, when the data begin, non-farm output per hour has been growing at a remarkably stable rate. In fact, if you took a 13-year moving average, it never varied from an annual rate of growth of 1% or 3%, 2-3%. We couldn't do more than 3% because we were at the cutting edge, and human beings, as much as we'd like to say we're terrific, are only so good, and we couldn't learn any faster than that. But there is no evidence that that essentially deviated. In other words, the long lead times that innovation is required to work its way into output per hour has not significantly changed as yet. I was mentioning to the Secretary before that some of the data now suggest that our younger people in the workforce are seemingly less productive than the rest of the system. That is, if you take the ratio of incomes of spending units headed by 25-year-olds and younger, it is clearly that ratio of income to the total average income of all families, or all spending units, that starts to go down. Now, the data aren't conclusive. This is a very rough calculation, and it will require a lot more sophisticated statistical techniques.
You know, Dr. Greenspan keeps talking about data, and he was a data fanatic when he was at the Fed. Do you worry that we're still not getting the data we need on classroom performance, student performance, teacher performance?
Oh, there's no question we're not. So I absolutely worry about that. I think you're starting to see a sea change there. But this idea that historically we had no idea what children actually learned other than a test they maybe took in May and got the results back in June and July, and then the child was on to the next school year, and it was too late to do anything different. But this idea of formative assessments, ongoing assessments, periodic every 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever it might be, every high-performing school I visit today, every single one has some form of higher assessments.
But you know, in most industries, you have a data-driven assessment every 4 minutes, not every 4 weeks. I mean, couldn't we do that in education as well?
Absolutely. And you have places now that are doing it on a daily basis, hourly basis. But my point is, as a country, we weren't even in this game, 10 years ago. And it's starting to move not as fast as we'd like, and it's part of what we need to do together to continue to accelerate that pace of change. It's not just the right thing for children, it's the right thing for teachers. This is taking great teachers and taking their craft to a different level, and they're finally able to understand what students are actually comprehending, how to better differentiate instruction, how to do small groups. Great teachers live for this kind of feedback that they just simply never got before.
And what type of technology do you see driving innovation best right now?
I don't know if there's one technology. I just think we're, again, going through this period of very rapid change. I mean, I could see in this country 5, 6, 7 years from now, we might not have textbooks anymore. Textbooks might be a relic from a different era. And you're starting to see schools now that already don't have textbooks. So we're in this midst of the sea change. I think the quicker we get there and the smarter we get there, the faster we're going to reverse some of these negative trends that we're seeing today.
Some of what we're doing today springs out of what you, Jim Shelton, and others did on the I3 fund. What did you think that drove?
I just think, so as hard as we're pushing everyone else to change, what I've said repeatedly, Walter, is I try and be very self-critical. I think our department historically has been part of the problem. We didn't seed innovation. We funded formula-based programs, Title I for poor children, special ed money for IDA funding. And everybody got their tiny slice of the pie, and we perpetuated the status quo. And so as much as we're trying to move everyone else outside our comfort zones, we think we as an education department should be in a very different business. We should be in the business of innovation. We have to be in the business of trying to fund fundamental breakthroughs. If you look at some of society's greatest breakthroughs, space flight, the internet, biotech, you've had government funding and private sector partnership. And that's what this I3 fund has been about. It's what Right to Top has been about. It's what Promised Neighborhoods is about. We're trying to get in a very different business. I'm convinced we have to do it. It's the right thing for children, right thing for the country, right thing for the economy. This is tough politically. This is not how Congress is used to acting. And we have some real challenges there to sustain this. But when we had money, as you know, to fund about 50 of 1,700 extraordinary applicants, I would have quite happily funded 5 times as many as that we had the resources.
The trade show, which everybody should see, is a lot of the applicants that didn't, quite make it. I think we have a lot of funders here. We're hoping to put them together. What do you suggest?
I think that's desperately needed. These are extraordinary partners, folks who have these aren't just like good ideas. This is people with a track record of driving achievement. And we need to take to scale what works. And what I'm just convinced, for all the challenges we talked about, the answers are out there in the country today. And we need to keep breaking through. But if we can just take to scale what we know is working, millions more children in this country would benefit. And this idea of these public-private partnerships, this matching, is how we have to behave. Heard this morning that I didn't quite realize it, but the I3, our funding plus the private sector match, may be the largest public-private partnership, not just in the country, but internationally. And I just think this is the direction that we need to go in, and we need to continue to push each other very hard. We want to continue to be a good partner. But if we get the kinds of breakthroughs that I think we can out of this, I think it changes how government does business.
Dr. Greenspan, when I was growing up, we thought television was going to be a great technology improving education. Did that work?
It depends on which direction you're talking about. I was raising this issue earlier today with the secretary. I'm trying to figure out what it is we're missing. There's something fundamental we don't get. And it can't be our funding requirements. It cannot be a number of various different programs which work, but not as much as they should. And I don't know the answer to this, and I'll be very curious. I know from personal experience, I went through grammar school, in fact, pretty much beyond, before television. And I spent my time reading. And reading is fundamentally different with respect to how one's intelligence evolves than passively looking at the tube. When you're reading, we're all introspectively aware that we try to understand what we're reading. Sometimes we have to go back. Sometimes we do various things. But we're interacting with the book. Television is in control of your consciousness. And I'm fearful, knowing what proportion of the day that our children in their intellectually growing stages watch television. I was wondering, and I don't know the answer to this, and be very frankly very curious, what the degree of television watching are in some of those societies in which the TIMS numbers are far in excess of ours. I mean, we've gone down. They are where we used to be. I mean, Singapore and obviously this Shanghai experiment, which I'm little questioning myself about, whether that's a rigged type of operation statistically. But in any event, I'd be very curious to know whether or not the rest of the world who are moving ahead of us correlate television viewing in one form or another. Because, as the secretary was telling you before, he didn't have television, or he purposely didn't. And I was thinking of this tiger mom phenomenon.
Well, wait, tell us that story, Mr. Secretary.
Recently, I'm struggling to get a hook on what it is that's happening. It cannot be that the IQ of this population has gone down as much relative to the rest of the world as what some of those data show. There is no evidence that I'm aware of which suggests that something sufficiently large is happening, which we don't get. And if you don't get the diagnosis correctly, the issue of a solution is very fleeting. And so, am I worried about television? I am, but I'd very much like to convert my worry into a fact which I don't know the answer to.
Secretary?
We were just talking backstage, and I said that my parents were pretty Puritan, and we grew up in a household without TV. Yeah. So I used to have to sneak to my friend's house once in a while to watch TV, but we spent our time reading. My parents read all the whole Tolkien series, and Moby Dick, and Tom Sawyer, and Huck Finn. It just instilled in me and my brother and sister and I a love of learning, a love of reading. So didn't quite understand it every single day growing up, but I think in the long term it was extraordinarily beneficial.
The technology that drives us, we're now entering a post-television generation of kids. A generation of kids that are growing up on digital interactive media. And there are two major differences between the digital realm and the television realm where I grew up. One is that it's interactive if it's digital, and secondly, it's networked if it's digital. How could that drive in? Is that going to be better than television?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And if we're not using technology to engage students' learning, I think we're missing the boat now. And there are all kinds of studies of elementary and high school and higher ed, huge course redesigns of getting getting rid of the sage on the stage, getting rid of the professor lecturing to an auditorium this large, and doing much more work on the computer with some assistance from adults. All kinds of studies that show students are learning dramatically faster, much more engaged in their learning with this combination of great technology and some help and supervision from adults. But this is where we have to go, no question about it.
Your mother, now that you mentioned her, ran an after-school program. One of the things we learned in New Orleans after the hurricane was that it was insane to dump kids on the street at 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon. That schools should be open at 6:30 or so. What mix of innovative after-school programs done by the private sector versus pushing the general school system to stay open till 6 do you see as a proper mix?
I think you need to do both. The latter, frankly, is probably easier. And let me just walk through it. What I tried to do when I ran the Chicago Public Schools is we ran the schools about 9 to 3. Our school day was far too short. But then I had a number of schools, the Boys and Girls Clubs come in, for example, run to school from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 9 o'clock at night. In tough economic times like this, it's nonprofits, social service agencies have a hard time meeting their budget. My argument was get them out of the bricks and mortar business, put all their resources into kids and after-school programming and tutoring and mentoring. We got in every neighborhood in this country, rich, poor, black, white, Hispanic, you have schools. Every school has classrooms. They have libraries. They have computer labs. They have gyms. Some have swimming pools. Those don't belong to me or to the principal or to the union. They belong to the community. There's great, great physical assets that are closed 75% of the day. It doesn't make any sense. And so opening the buildings to the community, bringing in the nonprofit partners, co-locating services, I think are a huge part of the answer. Programs not just for children, but for parents. GED, ESL, family literacy nights, potluck dinners. And so I think those kinds of partnerships that actually save money enable folks to have a much greater impact on young people and families are hugely important. In Chicago, we had about 24 schools that had healthcare clinics attached, so if students had asthma needs or psychological support they needed, they could get it right there and stay in school. I think we can move on that very, very fast. At the same time, you look at high-performing schools like the KIPP network, not surprising, they're just out working folks. They're working 30, 35% more than other schools, and if you're doing a good job and you're working 30% more, you're going to get better results.
Let me throw out something from our New Orleans experience, which was once you had choice and competition, the KIPP networks came in and they stayed open until 6 or 6:30. Other schools stayed open until 3 or 3:30. Parents chose the schools that stayed open later. Soon every school was staying open later.
Yeah.
How do we leverage what KIPP is doing?
Well, KIPP was one of the recipients of our grants to scale here. So, and they don't have they haven't cornered that. There are lots of high-performing schools that are sort of taking those basic lessons and expanding them. I think the bigger question is how do we create choice for children and families and communities who have historically been denied that choice. And I always think in our country, for centuries, the wealthy have had multiple choices. And I always think in education, what works for the wealthy probably would work for poor families as well. So wealthy families have had multiple, 3, 4, 5 good options. Poor families have often had one choice, and that choice was not a good one. So creating networks of high-quality schools in underserved communities. I'll give you one other example. When I went to college, I found out that lots of folks went to boarding schools. I had never heard of boarding schools before. But we have, for a long time, wealthy families have sent their children to boarding schools. I think we need some public boarding schools. And we have, C Charter does a fantastic job here in D.C., but I think we need networks of boarding schools for poor families or for children who are really struggling in the community. And so those kinds of options, if they work for the wealthy, we have to figure out how we create those kinds of opportunities for the disadvantaged.
Well, let me just ask you the question you just asked, which is, how do we get choice for low-income families?
Well, I think we invest in charter replication, which is what we're doing. We invest in the replication of high-quality district schools, but we have to create a climate at the local level where new schools are allowed to flourish. And there are all kinds of impediments to that. Legal barriers, facilities barriers. Thanks in part to Race to the Top, we saw about 36 states remove barriers to innovative new schools. We're going to continue to invest very heavily. But there have been many places that have been not friendly to innovative schools. It's as simple as that. And I think we've helped to change that climate pretty dramatically. But we're not there yet.
Dr. Greenspan, is it possible to have innovation without a marketplace of choice?
Probably not. Innovation is an integral part of the whole system of a churning free market democratic society. And it's a process that can't exist by itself. It's got to be part of an overall type of structure. And I think one would characterize the whole history of the United States as essentially that sort of thing. And I think innovation in education, which relates to innovation everywhere, because remember, the purpose of education is not a classical education in which you're essentially deriving knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's like absorbing the value of art. If you are a Shakespearean expert, it's in and of itself of value to you. But our education system, starting with land-grant colleges and the whole structure that came out of the 19th century agricultural system, where, remember, the very early innovations were agricultural, and the very early innovations in education were in the same particular area. And I think that we have to think in terms of a holistic set of policies, and that you can't do one without the other. And that's the reason why I'm so terribly concerned about the fact that we, without any forecast, slowed down very dramatically in the latter part of the 20th century for reasons I don't think we still fully understand. And I suspect at some point we shall, and maybe with Gene just showing up, he will give us the answer to the question he hasn't heard. Hi, Gene.
Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Gene. I know how busy it must be with the State of the Union coming up, and we have to keep education reform in it. So I appreciate very much, Gene, you coming. Gene, by the way, every now and then I run into him. He quietly, in the evenings with his kids, has always been a great supporter of education reform, and it's quite reassuring to have you now in that position in the White House. Tell us a little bit about the thinking of the President as he goes forward for the role of education in the State of the Union and the funding of the new budget with the budget cutbacks.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do, Walter. I'm going to come here and tell you what the President's going to say in the State of the Union. And then I'm going to preempt our whole budget message by doing that. And that will be my way of enforcing message discipline among our cabinet.
But you're only a couple weeks into the job, right? And we could
make it a very short tenure.
Yeah,
with that kind of, then I could work more full-time.
Yeah, right.
No, I mean, I think that I'm not going to try to give our overall education message with the Secretary here, who is clearly our leader on this, along with the President, obviously. But I would say, a few things, which is, one, for the economic team, this is core economics. This is not kind of off to the side. And I think what you will see, which I feel comfortable saying, is I think you'll see the President a little bit more now in the State of the Union, going a little bit beyond just what's the urgency of jobs right now and what do you have to do for competitiveness jobs going forward. I think, understandably, in the first year or two, it was hard to get people to even listen if you weren't talking about what you were doing to forestall the crisis, if you weren't 100% focused on jobs in the next 6 months. And that's still got to be our focus. We have 9.4% unemployment. But I do think you will see him now starting to say that in addition to what we have already done and will be trying to do more in terms of the immediate jobs situation, that the language and message and policies of competitiveness, what we need to be doing to build the long-term jobs for the future, becomes much more into center focus. And I think this debate, will come up even as we go through the budget, because I think one of the core things that's going to be important for us to do is to say we understand we have to get the deficit down. It's crucial. You have to get spending down. It's crucial. But this is not a meat-axe approach. You've got to be smart about it. You've got to look and say what is truly about productivity, about education. And to not allow kind of everything's the same across the board. So education, technology, race to the top, but also the stuff that's affecting people at the community college level, the worker training level. We have to kind of make the case that these are not things that you want to cut back on at all, that maybe they're things we need to expand even in a time of fiscal discipline. And, the other thing I would just say, just as a general point, is I think it is very challenging to have to be Arne Duncan right now and to be talking about what kind of education you're giving kids when you're looking at the future. I mean, think about if we were having this conversation in 1985. I wrote Walter writes a book every 2 weeks while he has another full-time job. I've written one in 52 years, but one of the things I put in that was that in 1993, and I mean this, the very intelligent, thoughtful people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics said that one of the most promising jobs of the future was the whole travel agent business. It made good sense at the time. It did. They were looking at forecasts of more retired people, middle class, traveling, early retirements. Seemed like a good idea. Just didn't quite foresee that internet thing coming. So now you have to look to the future. And the expression that I've always used is, it's as if you have to tell somebody they're training for the Olympics for 2020, but you're not going to tell them what sport they're going to be in. So if you had to train for the Olympics in 2020, you knew you were going to be in, but you didn't know what sport you'd be in. You'd know you want to be kind of quick and strong and agile, but, and I think that's the tough part is we have to be kind of looking at education in a way in which you're kind of thinking of not just a knowledge set, but a skill set. My feeling is that skill set is going to have a lot more focus on problem solving, a lot more ability of working in kind of multicultural teams of people, global problems. And, that's a lot different than just thinking about what your scores are on things. That's thinking about what is kind of almost the skill set, the interpersonal skill set that you'd want for, my daughter's 4.5, one child's 4.5, the other's almost 16. For 16, you can get some feel of what the world's going to look like, but for 4.5, you got to figure you want them to have certain types of abilities as a person for a world that you can't predict right now.
So how do you have innovation in the education sector connect to productivity growth in the next generation?
Well, one thing you've probably already talked about, and I think Arne has taken leadership on, and I will say it is, it's tough when you've been working on these things and then you're coming back 10 years later, and of course, you see a lot of the problems still exist. And, as you were referring to a little, I spent a lot of my time in the 8 years off working on education in developing countries. And, there are very different issues, unquestionably, but there are interesting similarities. You always have people promoting education technology, technological solutions, but you don't always know what is it that exactly makes it work. I remember studying in Ethiopia. They were doing distance training using technology in Ethiopia for children and for teachers. Well, for the teachers, they were adults, and if they got their certificate, they got paid more money. They were way focused, and the distance learning worked real well. For kids, didn't work at all. Unless there was somebody in the classroom watching them, helping them, you couldn't get rid of the individual element. So understanding just the basic human things, a 9 or 10-year-old still often needs an adult around helping them, telling them, keeping people quiet, helping them study. It's not enough. So understanding that. I wonder with my 4.5-year-old, we all have them watch things on TV. What is it about the show Sid the Science Kid? It is an amazing show. My daughter, goes around and says things like, "Is that non-standard measurement? It's the pumpkins decaying." What works? We all have our kids watch educational things, but I think the kind of things that Arne's doing at the I3, where you're at least kind of having a focus on innovation. Is it working? Is it scaling up? Understanding why it is. So it's not just either a series of anecdotes, but there's kind of a core view of kind of testing what works and why. Is it applicable? Can you have it go further? And I guess I also just, I know this is the kind of thing people were saying 10 years ago and they say now, which is, it just, again, this is maybe where having kids really does affect you. It is just amazing to watch the degree of entertainment they have. I mean, it is, for those of us, I was in college when Pong started. Pong, and then you watch your son, and you understand how hard it is to do your homework when you have these amazing 3D, war games they're playing and everything. It's hard to believe that all of that genius in the United States just has to be for that none of that genius could get turned to, something on the more educational side.
What policies could turn the genius of people making 3D games into people making great educational technology?
People have had ideas. They've had ideas of having like advanced purchase agreements and things. I don't want to try to make policy here, but maybe you do need to bring some market incentive. Maybe you do have to have more kind of competitions on what game that is both fun and teaches a third grader, all 50 states, or how to do certain math issues. And I think it's out there. I just don't think it's ever. It doesn't scale the way a popular Xbox game
I will
does.
say there's a lot of them on the floor today that's good. Gene said they don't scale. How do you make them scale?
Well, I think, again, go back to where we started. With common standards coming and with common assessments coming, we are creating a much more efficient marketplace. And I think there are lots of folks out there who can do very well by doing good going forward. And it was very tough with, again, lots of different standards, trying to customize everything at the local level. There are huge inefficiencies there. With a common measuring stick and a common set of standards, I think the marketplace becomes much more attractive for those geniuses on the entertainment side to get into industry, to get into the education sector, and they can make a lot of money.
I will say, because I've been dealing with Apple computers a bit recently, that Apple says that the existence of common standards now means that they can get into this business.
No, this is change. We're changing the rules. We're changing the paradigm. And it's the right
Let
thing.
me turn up the lights, if that's possible, and open this up for questioning. Raise a hand. There'll be a micro. Yes, sir. Shout. I'll repeat it. A microphone will get to you just as you finish. Oh, no.
My name's Jim Colmus from Knowledge Alliance, and I just want to congratulate you on this gathering and all that were involved in its creation. Mr. Chairman, Greenspan, in most sectors...
Dr. Chairman to you, but go ahead.
Dr. Mr. Chairman.
Your Highness will be
Your
fine.
Highness, That's pretty innovative.
How do I answer a question?
Okay, for the question. In most sectors, there is a heavy investment in R&D that serves as the front-end stimulus for innovation that ultimately leads to productivity. I believe that's so. In education, the R&D investment really is minuscule compared to defense. Agriculture was mentioned earlier, healthcare. And I'm just wondering, maybe that missing piece of the puzzle could be one of the missing pieces of the puzzle in connecting R&D or connecting innovation to productivity is a lack of a strong R&D infrastructure. And I was wondering if you might be able to comment on that in a kind of a general way.
Dr. Greenspan, Your Excellency.
Well, the notion of where productivity comes from in general is essentially in all aspects of technology from innovation, but innovation can have an extremely long lead time before it actually is a practical issue. And that's the reason why, for example, I thought that I was very much influenced by Professor Paul David at Stanford, who demonstrated that in an example with the electric motor that Edison lit up New York City in 1882, but it took until the 1920s until half the factories of the United States were electrified. And therefore, it is a very complex process of how innovation, ideas develop into true productivity. But let me just raise an issue which is implicit in here, and I want to make sure we approach this. We haven't asked the question of what do we do as this thing seems to have deteriorated, pending a solution. And I think that this is a triage issue. I think right now our universities are still doing well. But if you take the K through 12 problems and you begin to move them up, the entrance into the university system from resident Americans is going to be quite inferior, and it's inconceivable to me that you can maintain the status that our universities have unless we have students. And the only students that are out there are foreign, who are dying to come to the United States, are blocked in one form or another, essentially by the H-1B immigration issues. So I think we have to take a twofold issue here. One is to recognize that to protect our universities until we bring the domestic population up to our university standards, and two, to recognize that we cannot have increased standards of living. If you translate what some of the international data comparisons show with respect to our children, you cannot have those children consistent with staffing the ever more complex structure that we have, especially our shortfalls in math. And so it strikes me that unless we either abolish or very significantly open up the H-1B quotas, and for the time being, allow these students to come in, they will be helping our system of education, and they will be helping to staff our infrastructure. And I might say parenthetically, because we never think about this, but H-1B is a protectionist measure. It's protecting all of us who are in the types of professions which the Indians, the Chinese, and others who would come here would compete with us. And my suspicion is the one thing we would begin to see is that the average wage of the upper echelon of our income groups would start to come down as you move the protectionism out. And that, in general, is something which we should be looking for. So I think that this is an extremely complex problem we are dealing with.
Right.
And I think the Secretary has articulated the details as best as I've heard it, and I think very usefully so.
Gene, let me go back to the point about R&D spending, because the R&D spending that led to the Internet was generally out of the Defense Department.
Right.
We have a marketplace economic incentive for drug companies to do R&D spending. As an economist, what type of policies could get to serious R&D spending for education?
No, I mean, the case is very strong, and in the classic, in the most classic way, you, not to keep referring to my family, but my sister, who is an immunologist, does basic research at University of Chicago. What she will always explain to me every single time is every great discovery started with some basic research that you would have had no idea how it connects to a particular disease, no less something that someone would know they could make a profit on. And then that's the fear that people underinvest in something that's good for all of us because they can't know they can commercialize or internalize the upside. So to the extent that you have that in research generally, you could absolutely make the case that in education, where the diffuse social benefit is so great, but where there's, the normal economics would create a significant underincentive, perhaps for any one person to invest in that. So just the classic case for research, you could argue, is as strong in education as it is anywhere. So I think what you just mentioned is something we think we do believe and feel, all of us, that there is a strong case for that, and that is the type of policies that we're thinking about right now.
Yes, in the way back in a gray sweater standing up.
Hi.
Gray shirt, sorry.
Thank you. I guess in particular, this is for Secretary Duncan. My name is Jonathan Hefter, and I'm fresh out of college, running a startup. For some reason now going back into education. And certainly there's a lot of engagement with the venture capitalists, specifically the I3 program, to help bring the financing into education and innovation. But what's being done to lower the difficulty or the barrier of entry for startups such as myself to get through the famously complex problem of getting into schools?
It's a great question, and it's not an easy one to solve. As you know, we have 95,000 schools in the country. The concept of local control is very powerful in this country. I've spent a lot of time with the Minister of Education in China. It's a very different structure there, and some advantages, some disadvantages, but things move a little quicker. What I will tell you, without sort of fundamentally changing the structure, what every school, what every district, what every state is hungry for now is dramatically better results. And if you can, as hard as it is to get in, if you can get in and demonstrate success, there is an absolute marketplace. There is an absolute appetite out there. No one is happy when their schools have a 50 or 60 or 70% dropout rate. No one is happy when those students are sent to college, 40% need remedial education because they're really not prepared. And so as hard as it is, if you can find that place or two to get you in and maybe knocking in 15 doors, you shouldn't have to do that. But if you can get in and demonstrate an ability to drive student achievement, and I would just challenge you and challenge everyone here, this is where Jim Shelton, our team, has been so great, have the evidence, have the data to prove it. There are so many great ideas in education. There's very few that have the data to show the difference you're making in students' lives. If you can demonstrate that over time, I promise you there's going to be a serious marketplace out there for you.
Yes, right there at that table. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Cyrus Heckmat with examperformance.com. I pose this question to the panel. When I was growing up in first and second grade, what my teachers did was to give stickers or check marks to those students that did well on their homework assignments or their exams. And at the end of the semester or the quarter, the teacher would take the top few students, and those students would be able to select the prize. And that created motivation for the students to perform better. In today's world, what motivation do U.S. students have to perform better, whereas in other countries where there is a push that if you don't perform well, you will not go on the upper path?
So motivating students.
I think the kinds of things that happen to you in first and second grade are happening in classrooms today. We're all talking about our families today, so I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they today get a check or a star or get to go on blue if they have good behavior, and I can't tell you how motivating that is for my 2 children. So I don't, some of these techniques may be ageless. I think you're asking a larger question that I think is a fair one, that in other countries and other cultures, education success is revered and has a premium that it doesn't in this country. That's a much more complex question. But the idea of just basic incentives, don't cost a nickel, that teachers can do to reward good behavior, reward achievement, I think in good classrooms that's happening all over the country today.
Can I just add to that? I think that we do have a very extraordinary example of how competition and demand is impacting the system, and that's in the community colleges. The community colleges are I would suspect, but I don't know as much about it as I need to, are really filling a void in what is required because of the fact that the old original view that once you finished your education and once you got your first job, I mean, if you entered a steel mill, for example, in say 1948, you could expect to take your whole career at that plant. And in any event, the notion of shifting professions was considered inconceivable. But what community colleges have done is have created a vehicle that enables that to happen. And it's not that somebody pushed them. They just pulled up by their own bootstraps. They offered values which people sought. And I think that's sort of a very interesting template of how innovation works in the education area. I think that if we had blocked them, we disallowed them or made some argument that that's an inappropriate type of vehicle, I think this country would be far worse off.
Just quickly on the community college point, I think they have absolutely been sort of this unpolished, unrecognized gem along the education continuum. And whether it's 18-year-olds or 38-year-olds or 58-year-olds, as folks go back to retrain and retool in healthcare jobs and green energy jobs, technology jobs, community colleges are helping get the country back on its feet. Just to make a little news today and try not blow the meshes discipline that Gene talked about, but we're announcing today with the Department of Labor a $2 billion investment in two-year institutions, including community colleges, that are building great partnerships with the local business community. And the President's absolutely committed to continue to invest in unprecedented ways in community colleges because we think they are such a huge part of the answer going forward.
And to give a plug to two administration initiatives which we're involved with in the Aspen Institute, I think Penny Pritzker helped drive two things, a skills to workforce thing that is supposed to incorporate the community colleges into how do we tie what's being taught in those colleges to the skills that are needed in the workforce. And then a prize, which I think where Aspen Institute is helping to administer, which is for the best innovations in community colleges.
Yeah.
Gene?
Well, just not to take it back to the budget fights that we're going to have, but this conversation just goes to why we as a country have to choose wisely what we want to spend less on and what we want to spend more on, as opposed to just taking broad-based approaches. Look, what's wonderful about the community colleges, all the things the chairman said, but also, let's be honest, it's because they are heavily subsidized, they're not a huge burden on people. And so, when I see community college, I feel there's almost all benefit to going because it's at a reasonable cost, and if it ends up helping you get another job, then it's really worth the investment. If that doesn't happen and you're just a better parent, a more educated parent, it's still worth the cost. When those slots run out, the alternatives, and some of the alternatives are very good, but they're very, very expensive. And so right now, President's going to be meeting with the mayors and later today, and the stories are filled with the just harsh, brutal cuts that are going to happen at the state, local level, at the federal level. Now, again, some of this is absolutely necessary for us in getting our deficits down, being sustainable. But, it's hard to kind of see that debate and be here and say, well, everybody agrees we need community colleges, more high quality, more slots open. But I have to tell you, the fiscal pressures are going to be pushing in a very different place. And so, that just means we're going to have to make harder decisions as a country if we want to be doing more of what we should be doing more of while still controlling our fiscal situation at the federal and state levels.
There was a woman at the table, waving the hand there. I passed over last time.
Good morning. My name is Sherelle Walker, and I work with Scientific Learning Corporation. And this is for the Secretary. Mrs. Secretary, you talk about innovation. How do we get these good innovations into schools? And I'll tell you one that we don't talk about very often, and that's about brain research. How can brain research, and it's in many schools today with programs that are changing the lives of kids, how do we get more of that focus into things like the reauthorization that's coming up? How do we allow districts and superintendents to understand the impact that brain research can now have on really accelerating learning for students? We don't have to wait 2-3 years for these youngsters to catch up, especially when they don't have a good start from birth on. But brain research has been shown to make a significant difference. So how do we get that message, especially
Secretary?
as you're thinking about reauthorization?
Yeah, I mean, I think reauthorization is a piece of it. Let me take it back one step, and I always talk about this Louisiana example of how do we better train our teachers and principals. And I think it's one thing to do the ongoing professional development, that's really important, but how we do a much better job with the adults on the front end. Louisiana is doing something that no other state is doing right now. Louisiana tracks the records of tens of thousands of teachers. They track the records of tens of thousands of those teachers' students. And they can tell you what universities or what alternative certification programs that those teachers came from. And based upon how much actual students are learning in the classroom, you have universities starting to redesign their teacher education curriculum and include things like this to learn at the undergraduate level. Louisiana has no patent on technology. They've been the only state in the country with the courage to have this conversation. We have a couple other states starting to follow, but I think this innovation, this technology, the brain research, this huge advances in knowledge that are moving forward, those things are not, unfortunately, being taught to far too many today of our 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds who want to become teachers. And thinking about ways to fundamentally restructure and have some competitive pressures, have some marketplace play. Louisiana, I think, is leading the country there. And brain research is one area. There are many others. The use of data in instruction, actual hands-on teaching when you're an undergrad, not just a theory and the philosophy and the history of education. We need the country to implement what Louisiana has
there's
done.
one great undercurrent that we keep hearing at this panel, which is we need better data. We need to know which innovations are working and how to bring them to scale.
And we need better data, but I guess my challenge is it's not a technology challenge there, it's a courage challenge.
Right. Oh, yeah, data. We had data before we had the internet. I mean, Dr. Greenspan.
Well, I've always wondered why it is that such a significant proportion of our high school math teachers know very little math. What they do know is education. And it's always been my impression that it's far more important that for a teacher, they know the subject matter than they're good teachers. Because I recall, and I graduated from college, and as I was a graduate student, the first thing I did was to teach the course that I just had. Now, I would say as a teacher, I was terrible. But I knew the content in a way because it was fresh, and I got very good grades from the kids whom I was teaching. And I'm distressed by the fact of our educators tend regrettably to be at the lower echelons of the society in many respects, especially, for example, if everybody gets the same pay and the opportunities of people who know math are so much greater than those who know English literature, you know that the English literature professors in school or teachers in school are going to be much better than the math teachers. That's fundamentally wrong, and I think that one of the major fundamental structural changes that I think are necessary here is to reverse this issue. Teaching skills are very useful, but very much secondary to really understanding the subject matter. To teach somebody who's got a very tricky problem in not understanding some algebraic relationship, I don't care how facile you are with words. If you can't figure out what it is that the problem that the kid is raising and address that, it's a failure. And so I think that this is a critical issue which we've never addressed. And I think it gets to the very fundamental question of, is our basic education system to make educators or specialists in the areas which they are supposed to teach the kids about
Secretary
it.
Duncan?
I think it's a huge issue. And again, where we started the conversation on the lack of innovation, lack of movement. So we've had a shortage of math and science teachers in this country for a couple decades. This is not a new problem. And students start to tune out in 4th and 5th and 6th grade because their teachers aren't comfortable and confident with the math and science they're trying to teach. And it's hard to instill in a child a love of something that you're struggling to just comprehend yourself. So what we think and what you're starting to see in pockets now, you pick a number, 10 grand, 20 grand, 25,000. We think math and science teachers should be paid more money. And you're starting to see a small number of districts do this, particularly in disadvantaged communities, inner city, urban, and rural, where those discrepancies are even larger. But why we've insisted on paying everybody exactly the same for this long and not recognizing these marketplace challenges makes no sense to me. So now through the Teacher Incentive Fund, through the school improvement grants we're putting out, you're starting to see folks pay math and science teachers more money to work with the kids and communities who need the most help. We have to continue to do a lot more of that.
In the very far back, standing up. Yes, you win with the big waving hand. Yes. It's also a good exercise for our microphone runners.
My name is Michelle Joseph. I'm a principal in the Bronx, and I also a principal for Schools for the Future. My question, based on the previous question, is content knowledge is extremely important in teachers. However, the delivery of the instruction is also important. And many times there is a disconnect between how the instruction is delivered, maybe that's why some students will tune out, versus what is being taught. What are your thoughts on how to ensure at the college level in the educational programs and even with venture capitalists that there is more of a connection to how students are taught in addition to what they're taught?
So 2 complaints. I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of great young teachers around the country. The 2 basic complaints they have with schools of education. Let me be clear. Some schools of education are doing a great job, but frankly, they're in a minority. There are a lot that are mediocre, and unfortunately, there are a lot that are part of the problem. And there have been national surveys that ask teachers about what they thought about their previous training, and the dissatisfaction rate is pretty high. The 2 major complaints I've heard, lots of different communities around the country, are first, not enough actual hands-on practical teaching. So again, lots of theory of education, philosophy of education, history of education. They're not in actual classrooms, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year, learning, having a mentor teacher, being advised. You have the Gates Foundation now videotaping a couple thousand teachers around the country, starting to get some better sense there. But the lack of hands-on practical teaching experience is one. And the second one is this lack of instruction on how to use data to change what you're doing in the classroom. So many of our schools of education, the professors have been out of the classroom for 15, 20 years when this technology didn't exist. And so these great young teachers are learning it on the job. It's helping them get much better, but they're asking, why do I have to learn on the job, not when I'm training?
All right, I'll come back to the front to really keep our microphone. Oh, there.
Hi, I'm Jackie Chen. I'm from Erickson Institute in Chicago. My question is about testing. Nowadays, we know in our classrooms, we test our children, try to test our teachers. Yet, if we ask our math teacher in the classroom, how many of them really look at their students' work on a daily basis, which is actually the better way to know where their children are?
What do you?
So, short answer. I know we're running short on time here. Is that we have 40 states now working on these higher standards. Have adopted these common standards. You probably know there are 2 sets of states working in consortium. 44 states joined together to create this next generation of assessments. And great teachers are part of these teams working together. I think our tests today are far too simplistic, fill in the bubble tests, aren't evaluating some of the complex thinking skills that Gene talked about earlier. And with these higher standards, having these better assessments coming behind it, I think are going to be hugely important. So I think, again, using technology is a huge part of this. We can get much better. That leadership, that innovation's not coming from us in Washington. That's coming from courage and leadership at the state and local level. And to see the vast majority of the country, 44 states, working in these 2 different groups, I think gives us great hope for where this is going to go.
Gene?
And I guess I would just say that my 2 cents are that, and this may go to something you were saying, is that there's kind of the assessment that's like, how did the student do at the end of the year? Of course, you don't teach doctors to just determine whether the patient lived or died. You try to assess how they're doing as time is going on. And I think the kind of class, the teachers having a sense of classroom assessment, how to kind of be able to understand how students are doing as they are, and then being able to communicate that in a way that's transparent and clear enough that the student themselves and the parents themselves can be part of that. And I do think as we look at the assessment of whether you've met a certain standard, making sure teachers know how to assess week by week and to be able to translate that to, in a clear enough way that the student themselves gets it, but their parent can get them. And so there is more of a team assessing along the way instead of just finding out at the end, did you meet the target or not? And I think that is, that is the assessment, the portion of assessment that at least my 2 cents are sometimes gets too little focus.
Gene Sperling, head of the National Economic Council, Your Excellency, Dr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for an absolutely stimulating discussion.
Thank you so much.
Good. By the way,